Hey guys, tonight we step straight into a wide, frozen plain where the sky feels bigger than your problems and the wind feels personal. You're standing there in the Wild West, boots crunching on snow that squeaks underfoot, breath puffing out in little clouds that vanish almost as soon as you notice them. The sun has slipped away behind a low horizon, and the temperature drops like someone turned a cosmic dial without warning. Somewhere nearby, a half-built cabin creaks, and you're already thinking about sleep. Because out here, sleep isn't about comfort, it's about whether you wake up at all. You probably won't survive this with your modern dovet and phone charger expectations, and that's okay. That's part of the charm. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, feel free to comment where you're listening from and what the local time is. Someone out there is listening at 2 a.m., someone else during a sunny afternoon, and somehow you're all about to share the same cold night. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge forward, shoulders hunched, already understanding one basic truth of frontier life. A winter doesn't care about your plans. Early settlers heading west in the 19th century often underestimated how brutal nights could be once the sun went down. During the day, hard work kept you warm. Chopping wood, tending animals, hauling supplies, but night stripped all that away. Sleep became a carefully managed event, not a casual flop onto a mattress. One mainstream historical fact you quickly learn is that many frontier settlers slept in temperatures well below freezing, especially during their first winters before proper shelters were finished. Central heating was not on the menu, and neither were triple-pane windows. You look around at the land itself, realizing it dictates everything. The Great Plains, the Rockies, the high deserts, all had wildly different winter personalities. Some nights were dry and bitter, others damp and bone-chilling. Historians still argue whether settlers feared the cold more than hunger during those early months, but diaries suggest cold was at least hunger's equally annoying sibling. You can skip a meal and complain. You can't easily skip freezing. As you prepare for your first night, you're struck by how exposed you feel. The stars are sharp and bright, the kind of sky modern light pollution has politely erased. It's beautiful, sure, but also unsettling, like the universe is watching you shiver. There's a faint smell of wood smoke drifting on the air, promising warmth somewhere nearby, though not necessarily where you're sleeping. And here comes your first light joke of the night. Congratulations. You've traveled west for opportunity and freedom, and your reward is hypothermia adjacent bedtime conditions. You start to understand that early settlers didn't think of sleep as 8 uninterrupted hours. It was more like a series of pauses between waking up to tend fires, check animals, or make sure the roof hadn't developed a new personality in the wind. Quirky tidbit time: some settlers reportedly slept sitting up, especially in wagons or cramped shelters, because lying flat let cold air settle around the body. Not exactly the ergonomic advice you'll find on a mattress commercial. Your body feels different in this cold. Fingers stiffen, toes go numb. Breathing through your nose feels like inhaling tiny needles. You quickly learn the importance of routine, even on the first night. Before sleep, settlers would eat something hot if possible. Beans, stew, coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in. It wasn't gourmet, it was thermal strategy. Modern nutritionists might argue about caffeine before bed, but out here, staying awake slightly longer to tend the fire beats falling asleep forever. That's joke number 2, by the way. And yes, it's doing emotional support duty. You glance toward the shelter you'll use tonight. Maybe it's a rough lean-to, maybe a wagon, maybe the skeleton of a log cabin with gaps you could mail a letter through. This is where expectations die quietly. Blankets are precious. Space is shared. Privacy is a rumor. And yet, there's a strange calm in accepting it. You're tired in a deep, bone-level way. The kind of exhaustion that makes sleep possible, even when conditions are terrible. Historically, many settlers came from eastern states or Europe, where winters were harsh but predictable. Out here, weather could flip overnight. One diary entry from a plains settler describes falling asleep to calm skies and waking up with snow blown across the bed. Historians still argue whether these accounts exaggerate for dramatic effect or simply reflect how poorly sealed early shelters were. Either way, you're now mentally drafting a strongly worded letter to the concept of wind. As you lie down, or more accurately, arrange yourself into a vaguely horizontal shape, you notice how sound travels at night. Every creak feels louder. Every animal noise feels closer. The cold sharpens awareness, making sleep a negotiation between fear and fatigue. And here's joke number 3, congratulations again. You've unlocked the premium survival mode where even silence feels suspicious. You start to realize that winter sleep on the frontier wasn't just about enduring discomfort. It was about learning. Each night taught settlers something. Where drafts crept in, how long embers lasted, which blankets worked best. You're beginning that education now, on night 1, listening to the land, the shelter, and your own body. The cold presses in, but so does a strange sense of belonging. For all its hostility, this place is now yours, at least for the night. Your breathing slows as you settle, the rhythm steadying despite the chill. The fire crackles softly somewhere nearby. The stars keep their quiet watch. And as you drift towards sleep, you understand that surviving winter in the Wild West started right here, in these long, cold nights. Learning how to rest when rest was never guaranteed. You wake sometime before dawn, not because you're rested, but because the cold has opinions. Your eyes open to a pale, uncertain light seeping in from the horizon, and for a moment you can't feel your feet. That's normal now. You stretch slowly, careful not to waste warmth, and become aware of how the land itself has decided the quality of your sleep. Out here, geography isn't just scenery, it's the landlord, the architect, and the nighttime supervisor who never clocks out. You begin to understand that where settlers chose, or were forced, to stop determined how they slept through winter. On the open plains, there were no trees to block the wind, which meant nights felt sharper, louder, more exposed. In wooded regions, timber offered both building material and a kind of psychological comfort. Forests muffled sound, slowed wind, and made fires easier to feed. One mainstream historical fact quietly shaping your night is that early settlers often prioritized locations near natural windbreaks. Hills, tree lines, riverbanks. Not for beauty, but for survivable sleep. You imagine choosing a campsite as the sun sinks. Low ground might shelter you from wind, but it also collects cold air like a bowl. Higher ground stays drier, but catches every breeze. Historians still argue whether settlers understood cold air drainage intuitively or learned it the hard way, one sleepless night at a time. Either way, you're now painfully aware that cold has a way of settling exactly where you are. The soil beneath you matters too. Rocky ground pulls heat from your body faster than packed earth. Frozen dirt feels like a sponge for warmth. That's why settlers often laid branches, straw, or even spare clothing beneath their bedding. Quirky tidbit, some frontier guides recommended sleeping on pine bods not just for insulation, but because the scent was thought to keep spirits up. Aromatherapy, 19th century edition. You inhale cautiously and decide it smells optimistic. You also start to notice how water nearby shapes the night. Rivers and streams moderate temperature slightly, making nights marginally warmer, but they also bring dampness. Damp cold seeps through layers and settles into joints in a way that dry cold doesn't. Settlers near waterways often complained of aching bones and restless nights. Historians still argue whether this was due more to humidity or to the hard physical labor settlers endured during the day, but you suspect it's a teamwork situation. As you lie there, the land seems alive even in stillness. Frost forms silently. Snow creaks as it contracts. Somewhere in the distance, an animal moves, unbothered by the cold in a way that feels deeply unfair. Joke number 1 drifts in apparently. Evolution forgot to give you fur, and now you're paying for it. you realize that winter sleep wasn't just about shelter, but about micro adjustments to the environment. Settlers learned to read subtle cues: the way smoke drifted, how frost formed on grass, how wind shifted at sunset. These observations weren't poetic, they were practical. A poorly chosen sleeping spot could mean waking repeatedly or not waking at all. That's not melodrama, it's physics with attitude. In mountainous regions, nights were colder but often calmer, with snow acting as a sound dampener. In deserts, temperatures dropped dramatically after sunset, catching newcomers off guard. You think about settlers arriving from humid eastern climates, expecting winter to behave the same everywhere. Joke number 2, surprise. Geography has regional settings. The land also decided how much fuel you needed. In areas with scarce wood, fires were smaller, shorter lived, and more precious. Settlers sometimes rationed firewood overnight, letting fires die down and relying on bedding and body heat until morning. Historians still argue whether this practice increased illness or simply reflected necessity. Either way, lying there in the dark, you understand that every log burned is a future log you won't have. You adjust your position, feeling the ground press back. Sleep comes in shallow waves, interrupted by the need to shift, to listen, to assess. The land teaches patience. It teaches humility. And it teaches you that winter nights aren't conquered. They're negotiated. By the time dawn fully arrives, you're tired but wiser. You've learned that survival begins long before you close your eyes, with where you choose to lie down. The land has spoken, quietly but firmly, and tonight, you'll listen better. You spend the daylight hours working with a kind of focused urgency that only winter brings. Every swing of the axe, every lifted log carries the unspoken promise of a slightly better night's sleep. By the time the sun begins its slow descent, you're standing inside the rough outline of what passes for a cabin. It smells like fresh cut wood and cold air. And while it's far from comfortable, it already feels like progress. Early settler cabins were rarely the romantic log homes you've seen in paintings. One mainstream historical fact is that most were built quickly, using unpeeled logs stacked horizontally and notched at the corners, with mud or clay chinked into the gaps. The goal wasn't aesthetics, it was survival. Straight lines and tight fits could wait until spring. Right now, you just want walls that stand between you and the wind. You run a hand along the interior, fingers brushing rough bark and uneven surfaces. Splinters are a given. Drafts are plentiful. Historians still argue whether early cabins were actually warmer than well-built tents in the short term, since poorly chinked walls let in cold air. But cabins had one psychological advantage: you feel immediately they don't move. When the wind rises, the structure groans instead of flapping, and that alone helps you relax into sleep. The roof is another story. Many early cabins had simple pole roofs covered with sod, bark, or thatch. Heavy, yes, but insulating. Quirky tidbits: some settlers deliberately let snow accumulate on their roofs, knowing it added another insulating layer. You glance upward, half hoping the roof holds and half trusting physics more than carpentry. That's joke number 1 for the night. Inside, space is minimal. One room does everything: cooking, eating, sleeping, living. The bed, if you can call it that, is often a raised platform or a simple frame made from poles, topped with ropes or slats. You notice there's no wasted square footage. Settlers slept close to the fire, close to each other, and close to the walls, all in a careful balance of warmth and safety. As night falls, you light the hearth. The fire throws flickering shadows across the logs, and for a moment, hoeth. The cabin feels almost cozy. Almost smoke curls upward, sometimes lingering, depending on how cooperative the chimney feels. Historians still argue whether frontier settlers suffered chronic smoke inhalation, but many accounts mention stinging eyes and smoky nights. You blink a few times and remind yourself that at least you're warm. The floor is packed dirt. Cold radiates upward, seeping into your legs as you sit. That's why settlers often laid down straw, animal skins, or spare boards where they slept. You add what you can, creating a small island of slightly less cold. Joke number 2 slips in interior design in 1850 is mostly about not freezing. As you settle for the night, the cabin begins its symphony. Wood pops as it contracts. The wind finds new ways to announce itself. Somewhere a log shifts and you freeze, not from fear, but from reflex. Over time, you learn which sounds mean danger and which just mean wood being wood. This learning curve is steep, but necessary. One thing becomes clear quickly. Cabins weren't sealed boxes of warmth. They were semi-permeable membranes between you and winter. Settlers stuffed rags, moss, and even old clothing into gaps to block drafts. Quirky tidbit newspapers, when available, were often used as insulation. You imagine tomorrow's headlines sacrificing themselves for tonight's toes. Despite all this, sleep comes easier than it did under the open sky. There's comfort in walls, however crude. Your body relaxes incrementally, muscles loosening as the fire settles into a steady glow. Historians still argue whether improved sleep quality directly impacted settler survival rates, but it's hard to deny the connection between rest and resilience. You lie there, watching embers fade, feeling the cabin hold against the night. It's not perfect, but it's yours, built by your own hands. And as the cold presses in from outside, you drift into sleep knowing that this rough shelter is the difference between enduring winter and being defeated by it. You thought a cabin was the most primitive option, and then the prairie politely corrects you. Trees are scarce here, almost decorative, and winter doesn't wait for lumber shipments that won't exist for decades. So you turn to what the land actually offers: grass, roots, and dirt. This is how you end up sleeping inside a house made of earth, known simply as a sod house, or if you want to sound like a seasoned local, a soddy. You cut thick slabs of prairie turf, grass still clinging stubbornly to the soil, and stack them like bricks. One mainstream historical fact is that thousands of settlers on the Great Plains lived and slept in sod houses during the mid to late 19th century, especially in places like Nebraska and Kansas. The roots held the blocks together surprisingly well, and when stacked properly, they formed walls that were thick, dense, and excellent at blocking wind. You don't build a sod house because you want to. You build one because winter insists. Inside, the air feels different almost immediately. It's quieter. The wind's howl becomes a muffled suggestion rather than a full-volume complaint. The walls absorb sound, making the night feel strangely calm, like being tucked inside the earth itself. Joke number 1 slides in gently: congratulations, you've upgraded from exposed pioneer to human route vegetable. The temperature inside a sod house stays more stable than you expect. Thick earth walls hold heat from the day and release it slowly at night. Settlers often reported that sod houses stayed warmer in winter and cooler in summer than wooden structures. Historians still argue whether this thermal efficiency was fully understood by settlers or simply discovered through trial error, and a strong desire not to freeze. But comfort is relative. Dirt floors mean cold seeps upward relentlessly. Moisture is a constant companion. When snow melts or rain falls, the walls can weep slightly, sending little rivulets down the interior. Quirky tidbit: sod houses sometimes sprouted grass or flowers from the roof in spring, leading settlers to joke that mowing the house was part of home maintenance. You glance upward, imagine yourself trimming your ceiling with garden shears. Your sleeping arrangement reflects this balance of warmth and dampness. Bedding is kept off the ground if possible, raised on wooden pallets or crude frames. Straw mattresses, called ticks, are common. You stuff them full, hoping bulk equals insulation. You also quickly learn to keep blankets away from the walls, where moisture collects. Wet blankets are the enemy of sleep, warmth, and morale. As night falls, the sod house smells faintly of earth and grass. It's not unpleasant, just unfamiliar. The scent reminds you that you're borrowing space from the land rather than conquering it. Some settlers found this comforting, others found it deeply unsettling. Historians still argue whether sod houses affected settlers' mental health, with some diaries mentioning feelings of isolation and others praising the snug security. You settle down to sleep, listening to the near silence. Outside, the wind continues its work, but inside it's almost peaceful. The earth walls don't creak like logs. They don't flap like canvas. They simply exist. Joke number trog. Finally, a roommate that doesn't complain. Still, there are trade-offs. Insects and small animals occasionally share your space, especially before deep winter sets in. Dirt floors invite visitors who don't respect personal boundaries. You adjust your bedding, reminding yourself that at least the mice are also trying to stay warm. Community is important, even when it squeaks. Fire is used sparingly in sod houses. Chimneys are tricky to build, and the risk of collapse or smoke buildup is real. Many settlers relied more on bedding and body heat than roaring fires. Historians still argue whether reduced fire use led to colder nights overall or simply safer ones. As you lie there, you decide breathing easily is worth a little extra chill. One unexpected benefit of sod house sleep is darkness. Thick walls block moonlight and stars entirely, creating deep, enveloping night. Sleep comes faster, heavier, as if the earth itself is encouraging you to rest. Your breathing slows. Muscles loosen. The day's labor fades into a dull ache instead of sharp pain. You wake occasionally, checking for drips, listening for unusual sounds, but overall, this is one of the better nights you've had. The prairie may be harsh, but it's also practical. It gave you the materials to survive, and in return, you've learned to sleep like part of the landscape. By morning, frost coats the outside of your sod house, but inside, it's merely cool. You rise stiff but rested, grateful for walls made of grass and dirt. Out here, sleep doesn't require luxury, just enough ingenuity to convince winter to leave you alone for a few hours. Some nights, there is no cabin, no sod walls, no comforting illusion of permanence. You're still in motion, still chasing a place to stop, and winter doesn't pause for your logistics. So you sleep where you can, inside a wagon, under canvas, or simply wherever the trail decides to end for the day. It's not ideal, but neither is freezing, and you're learning to prioritize. You climb into the wagon as dusk settles, the wooden boards already cold to the touch. One mainstream historical fact is that many westward setters slept in their wagons for months at a time, especially during long journeys before claiming land. These wagons weren't designed for comfort. They were designed to haul supplies. Sleeping inside one is a lesson in spatial negotiation, especially when you're sharing it with people, tools, and the occasional barrel that refuses to stay put. You curl up as best you can, knees tucked, boots still on. Undressing is optional and often discouraged. Clothing is insulation now. Historians still argue whether sleeping fully clothed improved warmth or restricted circulation enough to make people colder. But out here, nobody's conducting controlled studies. You do what feels warmest and hope for the best. Canvas tents offer a different kind of compromise. They block wind better than open air but provide little insulation. Frost forms on the inside of the canvas, a glittering faintly in the firelight like winter's idea of decoration. Quirky Tibbig settlers sometimes woke to find their breath frozen onto the tent walls, creating delicate ice patterns that vanished as soon as the sun rose. You admire them briefly before worrying about your toes. The ground beneath the wagon or tent is your biggest enemy. Cold rises relentlessly, stealing heat all night. That's why settlers piled bedding thickly beneath themselves. Straw, spare clothing, even sacks of grain. You lie atop this lumpy foundation, trying to distribute weight and warmth evenly. Joke number one arrives softly. Who needs a mattress when you have agricultural products? Fire management becomes an art form. You can't safely keep a fire roaring all night near canvas or wood. Instead, you build it up before bed. Heat stones or iron cookware, and bring them close to where you sleep. Historians still argue how effective this practice was, but many accounts mention hot rocks wrapped in cloth and tucked near feet. You position yours carefully, aware that too close is as bad as too far. Animals play a role here too. Wagons are often circled, not just for defense, but to block wind. Livestock bedded nearby adds a surprising amount of ambient warmth. The smell isn't great, but warmth rarely is. Joke number two, suddenly, The horse you complained about all day is your favorite coworker. Sleep comes in fragments. Every sound feels amplified. The snap of canvas, the shift of wood, the distant howl of wind or wildlife. You wake often, checking the fire, adjusting blankets, flexing fingers to keep blood moving. Historians still argue whether settlers developed lighter sleep patterns out of necessity or whether exhaustion simply overpowered discomfort. From where you're lying, it feels like both. Despite everything, there's a strange intimacy to these nights. You're close to the people you travel with, sharing whispered conversations, muffled laughter, and mutual complaints about the cold. Humor becomes a coping mechanism. Joke number 3 floats by someday. You'll look back on this and call it character building. The wagon creaks as temperatures drop, wood contracting with sharp little pops. You pull your coat tighter, tucking your chin down to trap warmth. Breath fogs the small space. Outside, the world is vast and indifferent, but inside, you've created a tiny pocket of human persistence. Morning arrives slowly, pale light filtering through canvas or between wagon boards. You emerge stiff, groggy, but alive. Sleep may have been shallow, but it was enough. These nights on the move teach you flexibility. They teach you that rest doesn't require comfort, just determination and a willingness to adapt. As you pack up and move on, you carry this lesson with you. Whether in a cabin, a sod house, or a wagon, sleep in the Wild West is about making do. Winter won't wait, and neither will you. As night settles in again, you realize the fire is no longer just a comfort. It's a responsibility. You stare into the hearth, watching flames curl and snap, and knowing that this glowing pile of wood will decide how well you sleep, how often you wake, and whether you wake at all. Out here, fireplaces don't get to sleep, even if you desperately want to. One mainstream historical fact becomes immediately clear: the hearth was the literal and symbolic center of frontier life. In cabins and sod houses alike, a single fireplace provided heat, light, and a place to cook. During winter, settlers depended on it constantly, often keeping embers alive overnight so they could revive the fire quickly in the morning. Letting it go completely cold meant starting from scratch, which in freezing temperatures could feel like an insult layered on top of exhaustion. You crouch close, warming your hands, feeling the uneven heat on your face. Too close and it's stifling. Too far and the cold creeps back in. This delicate balance continues even after you lie down. Settlers often slept positioned so their feet faced the fire, since extremities lost heat fastest. Historians still argue whether this habit reduced frostbite or simply reflected how miserable could feet felt. But you're firmly on team warm toes. Fire management becomes part of your nighttime routine. You don't just toss logs in and hope for the best. You choose dense wood that burns slowly. Oak if you have it, cottonwood if you must. Softwoods burn fast and bright, offering quick warmth but demanding frequent attention. Quirky tidbit: some settlers reportedly preferred buffalo chips, dried bison dung, as fuel on the plains where wood was scarce. You wrinkle your nose and remind yourself that warmth is warmth, even if it smells historic. The danger of fire never leaves your mind. Cabins are dry, bedding is flammable, chimneys are imperfect. Sparks pop and drift, tiny glowing threats. Many settlers slept lightly, waking at the smallest change in sound or smell. Historians still argue how common cabin fires truly were, but enough accounts mention nighttime scares to keep you alert. Joke number 1 flickers inning. Nothing like a cozy fire to keep you warm and mildly terrified at the same time. Smoke is another constant companion. Chimneys are rough, often built of stone or clay, and they don't always draw properly. Wind shifts can push smoke back into the room, turning sleep into a coughing contest. You pull a blanket over your head, not for warmth, but to filter the air. It works a little. Your eyes sting, and you blink slowly, hoping sleep arrives before a headache does. Despite all this, the fire's presence is deeply reassuring. The soft crackle becomes a lullaby. Shadows dance across walls, familiar now. You find yourself waking just enough to check the glow, to add a log or nudge embers closer together. These half-waking moments blur into sleep, creating a rhythm unique to winter nights. Settlers didn't always sleep in long, uninterrupted stretches. They slept in cycles, tied to the fire's needs. You remember earlier nights without shelter, how exposed you felt. Here, even with the risks, the hearth gives a sense of control. You can influence the temperature. You can respond to changes. Joke number 2 warms its way in. You may not have indoor plumbing, but you do have indoor fire, and that feels like a win. The placement of bedding matters too. Too close to the fire and you risk sparks or overheating. Too far and cold winds. Settlers learn through experience, sometimes painfully, where the sweet spot was. Quirky tidbit: some families hung damp clothes near the fire to dry overnight, inadvertently adding humidity and warmth to the air. You consider doing the same, then remember that damp fabric can also freeze if you're not careful. Decisions. As the night deepens, the fire settles into a steady glow. You lie still, listening to the faint sounds of wood shifting, embers collapsing inward. Outside, and the wind continues its patrol, but inside, the hearth holds its ground. Historians still argue whether the psychological comfort of fire mattered as much as its physical warmth, but as your muscles relax, you suspect the answer is yes. Sleep comes in waves. You drift, wake, adjust. Each time your eyes open, the fire is there, quieter now, but persistent. It feels almost companionable, like a watchful presence keeping winter at bay. Joke number 3 arrives softly. You've never been so emotionally invested in a pile of burning wood. Eventually, the fire burns low, but not out. You let it be, trusting the embers to last until morning. Your breathing slows, thoughts stretch and fade. The hearth's gentle glow becomes part of your dreams, flickering behind closed eyes. By dawn, ash coats the firebox, and a few stubborn embers still glow faintly. You coax them back to life, grateful you didn't have to start from nothing. Another night survived, not just because of shelter or bedding, but because you learned how to share your sleep with fire, respecting it, relying on it, and never fully turning your back. By now, you've learned that warmth doesn't come from one miracle item, but from layers of small, practical decisions. Tonight, your attention turns fully to what you're actually sleeping on and under. Bedding, you realize, is not a luxury. It's the frontline defense between your body and the cold, unyielding world beneath you. One mainstream historical fact is that most early settlers did not have mattresses as you'd recognize them today. Instead, they slept on straw ticks, fabric sacks stuffed with straw, hay, or corn husks. These makeshift mattresses were cheap, refillable, and surprisingly effective at trapping air, which meant insulation. You kneel beside one now, patting it into shape, aware that its lumpiness is doing important thermal work. On top of the tick, you pile whatever textiles you own. Quilts, patched blankets, woven throws, all layered without much concern for matching patterns. Function beats fashion every time. Many of these quilts were handmade, stitched from scraps, and heavy enough to feel like they're pinning you gently to the bed. Historians still argue whether the weight of these blankets contributed to better sleep or simply made it harder to roll over. But you decide the pressure feels reassuring. Animal hides add another layer of defense. Buffalo robes were especially prized on the frontier, valued for their warmth and durability. Quirky tidbit: some settlers claimed buffalo robes were so effective that you could sleep through a blizzard wrapped in one. You test this theory mentally, then pull it tighter around your shoulders just in case. Beneath you, insulation matters just as much. Cold rises relentlessly from the ground, and settlers quickly learned that stacking layers below their bodies was critical. Branches, spare boards, folded clothing. Anything to create distance from the earth. Joke number 1 drifts in. Your sleep setup now looks less like a bed and more like a defensive fort. Clothing becomes part of the bedding system. You don't change into pajamas, you add layers. Wool shirts, socks, and hats stay on through the night. Settlers often slept wearing caps to prevent heat loss through the head. Historians still argue how much heat actually escapes this way, but the habit stuck, perhaps because cold ears are deeply annoying. You tug your hat lower, and feel instantly more prepared for sleep. The smell of bedding is distinct: wool, smoke, earth, and whatever the last meal happened to be. It's not unpleasant, just lived in. Over time, settlers grew accustomed to it, associating these scents with safety and rest. Quirky tidbits: some families added herbs like lavender or sage to bedding, believing the scents promoted sleep or warded off illness. You inhale and decide it smells like determination with a hint of plant. As you settle in, you test the layers, shifting slightly to find warm spots. The weight of blankets presses down, trapping heat. Your body slowly warms the space around you, creating a pocket of relative comfort. Historians still argue whether settlers slept better once their bedding systems were perfected, but judging by how your shoulders relax, the answer feels obvious. Despite all this preparation, the night still intrudes. Cold air sneaks in around ankles or necks, prompting half-asleep adjustments. You tuck, retuck, and occasionally mutter at the darkness. Joke number 2 arrives quietly. You've never negotiated so intensely with a blanket before. You think about how bedding represented security. Owning enough blankets meant survival. Losing one could be catastrophic. Settlers often recorded quilts and hides in wills and inventories, underscoring their value. Sleep depended on textiles just as much as on shelter or fire. That realization settles over you as heavily as the blankets themselves. Eventually, the adjustments slow. Your breathing evens out, the weight, the warmth, the familiar smells all work together. Outside, winter continues its endless routine, but inside your small cocoon, rest becomes possible. You drift towards sleep, wrapped in layers of fabric, hide, and quiet resilience. The bedding holds, doing its humble, vital work. Another night passes not because conditions improved, but because you learned how to meet them. One layer at a time, you reach a point where the idea of changing clothes before bed feels almost laughable. Out here, nightwear isn't a thing. It's a liability. When the sun drops and temperatures follow, you simply keep on what you've been wearing all day, maybe adding a layer or two if fortune allows. Sleep, like everything else, happens fully dressed. One mainstream historical fact is that frontier settlers commonly slept in their daytime clothing during winter, especially wool garments that retained heat even when damp. Wool was the unsung hero of frontier sleep. It breathed, it insulated, and it didn't turn into an icy betrayal the moment moisture appeared. You feel the scratch of it against your skin and decide that comfort is negotiable, warmth is not. You layer deliberately. A wool shirt, maybe another over it. Thick trousers tucked into socks. Socks doubled if you're lucky. A vest, a coat, sometimes even a scarf wrapped loosely around your neck. Historians still argue whether too many layers restricted circulation and made people colder overall. But the lived experience recorded in diaries suggests settlers trusted layers more than theory. Right now, theory isn't keeping your knees warm. Your boots often stay on or sit within arm's reach. Cold leather stiffens overnight, turning boots into hostile objects by morning. Some settlers slept with boots under blankets or near the fire to keep them pliable. Quirky tidbit: there are accounts of people wearing their boots to bed during extreme cold snaps, accepting discomfort to avoid frozen footwear. You wiggle your toes and silently thank yourself for at least loosening the laces. Hats become essential. Heat loss or not, a covered head feels warmer, and that feeling matters. Knit caps for hats, even wrapped scarves do the job. You pull yours down low, ears disappearing into fabric. Joke number 1 drifts in jute. Fashion has officially lost this battle. Sleeping in clothes also means sleeping in the day's dirt, sweat, and smoke. There's no nightly reset, no clean sheets waiting. Settlers accepted this as part of life. Historians still argue how hygiene impacted health on the frontier. But many people simply didn't have the luxury of separating day clothes from night clothes. You shift slightly, aware of grit where grit shouldn't be, and let it go. The upside of sleeping dressed becomes clear when you wake in the night. There's no shock of cold air on bare skin. You can rise quickly to tend the fire or check a noise without fumbling for layers. Your body stays in a consistent thermal state, which helps you fall back asleep faster. That consistency, you realize, is a kind of comfort. Children are bundled like parcels, wrapped and rewrapped until only noses peek out. Elderly settlers often sleep closest to the fire, layers piled high. Everyone adapts clothing to their needs. Quirky tidbitting, some settlers stuffed spare cloth or rags inside sleeves or pant legs for extra insulation. You consider doing the same, briefly wondering when exactly your life turned into an experiment in human packaging. As the night deepens, the layers begin to work together. Your body heat builds slowly, trapped by wool and fabric. Muscles loosen. Breathing steadies. The initial stiffness fades into a tolerable heaviness. Historians still argue whether this layered approach truly improved sleep quality, but you're drifting, which feels like evidence enough. There are moments of discomfort. A seam presses wrong. A button digs in. You adjust half asleep, shifting fabric without fully waking. Joke number 2 arrives softly. You've never been so aware of every button you own. Despite the awkwardness, there's reassurance in being dressed. You're ready in a way. Ready for cold, for interruption, for whatever the night decides to bring. That readiness eases your mind, allowing sleep to take hold. Outside, winter carries on, indifferent. Inside, wrapped in wool and determination, you rest. Not perfectly, but enough. And out here, enough is everything. You soon discover that warmth isn't about materials or shelter. It's also about proximity. In the close quarters of a frontier cabin, or the limited space of a wagon, you learn the undeniable truth: heat shared is heat retained. Bodies pressed together overnight become a collective furnace, a network of warmth that single layers and fires alone cannot achieve. One mainstream historical fact is that early settlers often slept in groups. Families huddled together to conserve heat. Beds were shared not only out of necessity but also because space was scarce. Adults, children, and sometimes older relatives all participated in this communal strategy. Historians still argue whether such arrangements encouraged stronger family bonds or simply reflected logistical necessity. But either way, it's undeniable that warmth multiplied with numbers. You position yourself strategically, shoulder to shoulder with someone else, feeling the subtle exchange of heat through layers of blankets, wool, and skin. Quickie tidbit: frontier settlers sometimes arranged their sleeping positions based on who retained heat best, putting the most resilient sleeper at the center. You smile at the idea that thermal management was its own social hierarchy. Children are tucked in first. Their small bodies lose heat faster, so they are often placed in the middle of the group, wrapped and surrounded. Elderly relatives, slower to generate warmth, are often nearest the fire or hearth, with blankets strategically layered over them. You notice how deliberate this system feels, like a choreography aimed at survival rather than comfort. There's an intimacy to shared warmth that's both practical and oddly comforting. You hear soft breathing, gentle rustling of blankets, and the occasional whispered conversation. Humor becomes subtle, quiet jokes about who's hogging which side of the bedding or how the cat, or more likely, a stray dog, is claiming the warmest spot. Joke number 1 drifts in softening: the fiercest battles of the frontier are waged over blankets, not territory. Animals are part of this thermal ecosystem too. Horses, pigs, or even dogs may sleep nearby, their bodies radiating heat into the immediate environment. Settlers quickly learned that having livestock close could make a meaningful difference on bitter nights. Historians still argue how much this practice contributed to frostbite prevention versus general comfort, but you can feel its logic: animal heat is free, abundant, and surprisingly reliable. The group dynamic extends beyond warmth. Shared sleeping arrangements allowed for easier night watches, quick responses to fires, or tending sick family members. In this way, communal sleep became a subtle form of security. You notice yourself subconsciously appreciating the rhythm of movement, the way someone shifts to shield another from a draft, or how laughter gently punctuates the otherwise serious business of staying warm. The weight of blankets, the shared body heat, the carefully stacked layers. These combine to create a microclimate of survival. You adjust slightly, accommodating shifts, finding the balance between comfort and space. Joke number 2 arrives quietly. Nothing says frontier teamwork like negotiating sleeping positions in the dark. As sleep takes hold, you notice how your body adapts to proximity. Limbs mold to gaps, shoulders press into warmth, and the slight smell of others becomes part of the olfactory landscape you associate with safety. Historians still argue whether this closeness affected social behavior long term, but for now, it's simply effective. Outside, the wind hammers against the walls, but inside, you are a small, bundled island of heat. It's a nightly strategy that requires coordination, patience, and a willingness to share both space and warmth. And in this quiet intimacy, sleep finally begins to deepen, layering over the exhaustion of the day like a soft, persistent blanket. By the time dawn creeps in, you awaken slightly stiff, but deeply grateful for the collective body heat that carried you through another night. Winter is unrelenting, but together you endure. Animals, you quickly realize, are more than companions. They are living, breathing heaters. Horses, cows, pigs, even dogs, all become integral to surviving winter nights. You watch a horse shift in its stall, nostrils flaring, and feel the warmth radiating outward, warming the air around the cabin. In frontier life, a proximity to animals could mean the difference between shivering awake and a slightly more comfortable slumber. One mainstream historical fact is that settlers often built cabins or barns with animal stalls directly attached to living spaces. This wasn't luxury. It was a calculated decision to borrow body heat. Frostbite and hypothermia were real threats, and a sleeping horse provided a consistent, low-maintenance source of warmth. Historians still argue whether proximity to animals contributed more to comfort or to the spread of illness, but diaries frequently praise the warmth and reassurance they provided. You move closer to the nearest stall, feeling the gentle heat waft from the animals through the wooden partition. Quirky tidbit: some settlers slept with one arm dangling through a gap toward the animals, claiming that the warmth from a cow's flank was a better nightcap than any blanket. You consider trying it, but decide against risking a curious bite. Joke number 1: egg. Apparently, personal space was negotiable if it came with heat. The smell of livestock is distinct. Earthy, musky, a little pungent. But over time, it becomes comforting. You learn to associate it with safety, warmth, and predictable body temperature. Animals were consistent. Unlike human companions, they didn't argue about blanket territory or snore too loudly. Their presence was reliable in the way only living heat can be. Night routines now include checking on the animals. A restless horse or shivering cow requires a minor adjustment to the sleeping layout. Settlers often built small passages between barns and cabins, allowing humans to attend to livestock without fully stepping outside into the freezing air. Historians still argue how much energy was expended maintaining animal warmth versus human comfort, but you can feel the trade-off as you shift toward the stable. Sleeping near animals also provided security. The sound of hooves and rustling straw could alert you to predators or thieves. It was a dual-purpose solution: heat and early warning system. You tuck slightly closer to the warmth radiating through the walls, grateful for this living insulation. Joke number 2: drifts ing. Nothing like sharing a room with a cow to feel simultaneously safe and mildly awkward. Animals sometimes interrupted sleep, though. Horses pawing the ground, a pig snuffling, dogs scratching at boards, all created subtle disturbances. Settlers adapted, developing lighter sleep or learning which sounds were harmless and which required immediate attention. Quirky tidbit: some families claim to recognize individual animal footsteps in the dark, adjusting blankets in anticipation of a curious nuzzle or accidental kick. As you settle back into your bedding, you notice the thermal gradient created by the animals. Warmth radiates upward, pooling around your feet and legs. Your torso remains insulated by blankets, while your extremities enjoy this borrowed heat. Historians still debate whether sleeping closer to animals improved overall survival rates, but anecdotal evidence and diaries abound with praise for the practice. You breathe in slowly, feeling a rhythm between human and animal. The night outside remains harsh and different, but inside this carefully arranged ecosystem, sleep becomes possible. Your muscles relax, shoulders ease, and eyelids droop. Joke number 3, who knew that barnyard logistics were key to civilized sleep? By the early hours of morning, you awaken only briefly to the subtle movements of your four-legged roommates. Each shift of weight, each breath of warm air, reminds you that survival in winter isn't a solitary affair. Heat, companionship, and careful planning intertwine, letting you drift through the night despite temperatures that would have been unforgiving a few away. You stretch slightly, smiling in the dim light, realizing that tonight, like many nights before, the animals have done more than just eat and breathe. They've actively contributed to the survival of your small, fragile human self. Winter nights were not conquered in isolation. Long before settlers even built cabins or arranged their bedding, they borrowed wisdom from those who had lived here far longer, the indigenous peoples of the land. You notice patterns now that weren't immediately obvious. Fire placement, insulation methods, even the ways to block drafts. You start to understand that settlers didn't invent winter survival, they adapted, often quietly, from existing knowledge. One mainstream historical fact is that many settlers learned essential winter techniques from local Native American tribes. Methods included layering hides, or building insulated shelters, and crafting makeshift bedding from grasses, moss, and bark. These strategies were critical for enduring the first brutal winters, especially on the plains where timber was scarce. Historians still argue to what extent settlers fully acknowledged these influences, but the evidence in journals and letters suggests a clear exchange of practical knowledge. You watch how indigenous-inspired techniques improve your sleep. Branches stuffed into gaps, layering of hides, and even the strategic use of animal skins as pillows all contribute to comfort. Quirky tidbit: some settlers reported that sleeping on a thin layer of cattle fibers beneath a tick made them feel lighter and less constricted, and an observation borrowed from native methods. You test it cautiously, noticing subtle relief in your shoulders. Fire practices also reflect borrowed wisdom. Native Americans often used central, low fires to preserve warmth without consuming excessive fuel. Settlers incorporated this, learning to maintain embers overnight rather than letting fires roar out of control. Joke number 1, drifts in heat. Nothing like a little borrowed genius to keep frostbite at bay. Sleeping arrangements were influenced too. Settlers began to recognize that arranging bodies for maximum warmth and minimizing drafts was more effective than simply piling blankets. Indigenous communities often positioned sleeping platforms against walls or near the center of the shelter to retain heat. Historians still argue whether settlers consciously adopted these layouts or merely stumbled upon similar solutions, but the results speak for themselves. The use of natural insulation is another borrowed trick. Moss, leaves, and bark were layered beneath and around sleeping areas. You marvel at the ingenuity, realizing that these simple materials trap heat efficiently, even in sub-zero temperatures. Quirky tidbit: some accounts suggest settlers sprinkled crushed cedar or sage among bedding to deter insects, again following practices learned from local tribes. You inhale the faint, comforting aroma and tuck it into your mental survival toolkit. Observing these techniques makes you aware of the social aspect of learning. Tips were shared quietly, sometimes reluctantly, between neighbors and travelers. The frontier was a harsh teacher, but indigenous methods offered shortcuts through trial, error, and sometimes unnecessary suffering. Joke number 2, drifts in. You now have more mentors than you ever signed up for, some of them with feathers. As night deepens, you arrange your bedding using these combined methods: clothing, hides, grass, and strategic body placement. The temperature inside feels more controlled. Your breaths are slower. The occasional creak of wood or rustle of animal fur is no longer alarming, it's part of the rhythm. You realize, lying there, that this subtle borrowing of knowledge is part of what allowed settlers to survive long enough to build permanent homes. Winter sleep is not just about endurance. It's about adobservation and sometimes humility. Humor, warmth, and borrowed wisdom intertwine, creating an unexpectedly cozy experience. By the time you begin to drift fully into sleep, you notice a deeper sense of connection to the land, to the people who taught practical survival, and to the small routines that make freezing nights livable. You're no longer simply enduring winter. You're participating in a lineage of cleverness that stretches across cultures and generations. Joke number 3, you may not have invented comfort, but tonight, you've certainly earned it. The prairie offers an unexpected alley in snow. You might think that freezing white expanses are nothing but a threat, but settlers quickly learned that snow could be, paradoxically, a form of insulation. You watch it accumulate against your cabin walls, thick and unyielding, and feel a subtle sense of relief, the very thing that chills also protects. One mainstream historical fact is that snow banks against walls act as thermal buffers. They slow wind penetration and help maintain interior warmth. Many early settlers deliberately piled snow along exterior walls or even used it to fill gaps in sod houses. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread or limited to particularly inventive individuals, but diary entries repeatedly note its effectiveness. You glance at the windows, noting the way the frost seems to cushion the cabin from the wind's howl. Quirky tidbit: some settlers built temporary snow walls around tents during particularly fierce nights, effectively creating miniature igloo-like structures. You imagine yourself shoveling in silence, a human snow fort offering modest protection. Joke number 1. The only time you'll be happy to shovel your own roof without complaint. Snow's insulating magic isn't just external. When piled around a cabin or tent, it keeps the temperature inside slightly higher than outside. Cold air moves more slowly through dense snow than through open air, so frostbite and numb extremities can be delayed. You lie back considering that this crystalline enemy also quietly keeps you alive. But snow is also unpredictable. Wet snow leaks, drifting snow can block doors, and icy buildup can press on roofs. Settlers had to balance insulation benefits with structural risks. Historians still argue whether winter building methods fully accounted for snow's variability or whether some nights were simply survived by luck. You feel that luck is in short supply tonight, so every precaution counts. Inside, you notice how the snow muffles sound. The harsh wind outside becomes a soft, rolling sigh. Animal noises are dimmed. The cabin feels like it's floating in a quiet world of white. Quirky tidbit: settlers often remark that a heavy snowfall could make a normally noisy prairie feel like a cathedral, a sacred pause before winter resumed its assault. Joke number 2, drifting: you didn't know silence could feel so chilly. The thermal gradient of snow is subtle but real. Air trapped within walls of snow resists heat transfer. This means embers, bedding, and human body heat are more effective than you imagined. You shift slightly, feeling the warmth of the blankets magnified by the snow outside. Sleeping near the hearth, layered under wool and hides, you realize that snow, paradoxically, amplifies the interior microclimate. Snow also affects routines. Settlers often banked snow before nightfall, shaping it into windbreaks or compact walls. A few even used it to create outdoor sleeping enclosures for extreme emergency nights. Historians still debate whether these extreme snow strategies were clever ingenuity or desperate improvisation. You quietly decide that both explanations probably coexist. You settle fully into your bedding, feeling the layered effect of clothing, quilts, and animal hides amplified by the insulating snow outside. Each breath seems slightly warmer. Your body relaxes. The wind continues its nightly complaints, but you're buffered, cocooned, and calm. Joke number 3. Only the coldest math could make freezing air work in your favor. By the time sleep fully arrives, you feel an almost imperceptible partnership with the snow. It's a silent guardian, an unacknowledged co-conspirator in survival. Winter remains indifferent, but you are wrapped in layers, warmth, and quiet reassurance. Tonight, snow is not the enemy. It's the secret ally that helps you endure. Wind, you quickly realize, is the great negotiator of winter nights. No matter how much preparation you've done, how many layers you've piled on, or how well your shelter stands, it always has a say. You hear it whispering across the plains, tugging at canvas, rattling logs, and slipping through every gap it can find. Out here, you learn to respect it. One mainstream historical fact is that settlers often positioned their cabins or tents deliberately with prevailing winds in mind. Corners were reinforced, gaps sealed with mud, moss, or spare clothing. Some pioneers even oriented the smallest openings away from the predominant winter gusts. Historians still argue how effective these methods were compared to sheer luck, but experience records their relative success. You crouch near a window, testing the draft, appreciating every small victory against invisible air. You notice that wind isn't just about cold, it carries sound, too. A howling gust can make a distant coyote sound like it's standing inside your cabin, or make the creak of a log feel ominously close. Quirky tidbit. Settlers sometimes hung old cloths or animal hides over openings to muffle noise as well as block cold. You pull a spare quilt over a drafty corner, imagining it as acoustic insulation too. Joke number one, interior decorating advice from 1870 includes hung dead cowhide, also keeps wolves confused. A wind management extends to personal positioning. You angle your body, rearrange bedding, and even adjust fellow sleepers if necessary. Heat circulation becomes a complex puzzle, with drafts creating microclimates within the same room. Historians still argue whether settlers consciously mastered these patterns or simply stumbled upon them through trial and error, but your current arrangement feels like strategic brilliance, if nothing else. Fire placement is a direct response to wind. You notice how the flames dance more violently when a gust sneaks in, sometimes sending sparks in unwelcome directions. Settlers had to anticipate these changes, shifting logs, adjusting chimneys, or creating small windbreaks outside. Quirky tidbit. Some pioneers kept small sticks balanced near openings to predict wind shifts. The subtle tilt of a stick could forewarn of a new gust. You glance outside and consider adopting the same primitive weather vein. Sleeping with the wind in mind also affected clothing choices. Hats, scarves, and layers were not merely for warmth. They acted as barriers against gusts sneaking under collars or through cuffs. Wool was the material of choice, dense and resilient, while cotton or linen layers were supplementary. Joke number two, you may not feel stylish, but you're now a certified wind negotiator. The wind also teaches patience. You learn to wait for its rhythm, to recognize the moments when it pauses, and to maximize warmth during these brief intervals. Settlers recorded nights spent awake, and not from cold alone, but from watching and listening, predicting gusts and adjusting fire or bedding accordingly. Historians still argue how much these routines improved survival versus simply keeping people awake longer. Either way, you find yourself emulating these adjustments unconsciously. You notice how the wind's absence feels almost unnatural. A still night allows the ambient warmth to accumulate, letting embers, blankets, and body heat work efficiently. The contrast makes every gust more perceptible, every chill more urgent, and every layer of clothing suddenly meaningful. Quirky tidbit. Settlers sometimes described nights of still air as the quiet heat of heaven, a poetic way to praise moments when winter temporarily relented. Joke number three, if heaven smells faintly of wet wool and ash, that would explain the poetic bit. As you settle deeper, adjusting blankets and shifting just enough to counter minor drafts, sleep finally asserts itself. The wind may still howl outside, indifferent and relentless, but inside your carefully managed space, it is contained, negotiated, and softened. Tonight, as always, survival is a combination of preparation, observation, and small victories against the unseen force that is winter wind. Moisture is another constant companion that you've come to respect, or at least tolerate. Condensation collects on walls, floors, and even the ceiling of your cabin. It's subtle at first, a misty coating that clings to wood or sod, but over the course of a night, it becomes noticeable. Out here, moisture isn't just discomfort. It's a factor in warmth, health, and how well you can sleep. One mainstream historical fact is that settlers often used bedding and clothing not only for insulation but also as barriers against dampness. Straw ticks, animal hides, and quilts were layered carefully to keep moisture from reaching skin. Historians still argue whether these methods prevented respiratory illness or simply minimized the feeling of cold, but the experience of dryness, or lack thereof, was central to sleep quality. You pat your bedding, testing for damp spots. Quirky tidbit: some pioneers placed a layer of pine needles or grasses between the mattress tick and the floor to absorb moisture and add insulation. You adjust your sleeping position, noticing how small gaps in this natural mattress system make an enormous difference in comfort. Joke number one: yes, you're basically lying on a DI hay spa. Clothing plays a role here as well. Wool, once again, proves indispensable. It insulates even when slightly damp and wicks moisture away from the skin. You pull your woolen layers closer, appreciating how they function like a portable micro-environment. Historians still argue whether settlers understood the full science behind this or simply observed what worked, but observation counts in sub-zero conditions. You also notice that condensation can subtly alter heat retention. Cold droplets on the walls cool the surrounding air, which can create unexpected drafts. Settlers learned to position their sleeping platforms away from such problem areas, or to build small barriers using spare wood, blankets, or even stacked possessions. Quirky tidbits: some pioneers placed tin pans strategically to catch dripping condensation before it reached bedding. You imagine waking to a metallic plink in the quiet hours of night. Joke number two: nothing says romantic frontier life. Like impromptu tin plumbing, moisture management isn't purely about comfort, it's about survival. Damp conditions increase the risk of frostbite and hypothermia, especially if body heat is lost to wet clothing or bedding. Settlers often rotated bedding, removed damp layers, or carefully dried items near the fire before sleeping. Historians still argue how much these small interventions actually changed outcomes, but clearly they were considered important enough to record repeatedly. Even the simplest gestures become meaningful. You shift slightly to avoid a damp patch. You breathe a little more shallowly to prevent condensation from forming near your face. You notice how the placement of every object, every log, every bundle of clothing contributes to a delicate equilibrium that determines whether sleep is restorative or restless. Animals affect moisture too. Livestock radiates warmth but also adds humidity, which can both help and hinder. Settlers had to consider how close to place animals for maximum benefit. A well-chosen position could help trap heat without saturating the interior with excess moisture. Joke number three: apparently, managing a cow's breathing is part of frontier interior design. As the night wears on, you find that the dampness is less intrusive than it was at first. Layers, insulation, and careful placement create a bubble of relative dryness. You lie back, feeling the slight give of straw beneath you, the comforting weight of blankets, and the steady radiance of embers nearby. Moisture is present, but it no longer dictates your experience. Sleep finally creeps in, a slow, forgiving descent into rest. Outside, winter continues its silent rule, indifferent to moisture, wind, or temperature. Inside, however, the small human ecosystem you've constructed, layers, fire, animals, and ingenuity, creates a manageable microclimate. Tonight, dampness is just another element to negotiate, a small puzzle rather than an insurmountable obstacle. Food, you realize, plays an unspoken role in winter sleep. You might think meals belong solely to daylight hours, but in the frontier, the timing, quantity, and type of food eaten before bed can determine how well you rest. A heavy supper can make you sluggish, while too little leaves you shivering and restless. Settlers learned this quickly, often through trial and error, or rumbling stomachs. One mainstream historical fact is that frontier dinners were typically high in protein and fat during winter months, designed to fuel long, cold nights and the physical labor that preceded them. Meat, beans, dried grains, and occasionally preserved vegetables formed the backbone of sustenance. Historians still argue how evenly such meals were distributed across households or social classes, but diaries consistently emphasize their role in nighttime comfort. You nibble slowly, feeling the warmth of cooked food spread through your chest. Quirky tidbit: settlers sometimes added a pinch of dried herbs or even alcohol to evening meals, believing it would help with warmth or digestion. You sip cautiously, noting the faint tingle of spices warming your throat. Joke number one: apparently, frontier gastronomy included optional herbal kickstarters for bedtime. Timing matters more than quantity. Eating too close to sleep can cause discomfort, while leaving long gaps risks a dip in body heat as energy stores deplete. Settlers often structured their evening routines around the meal, fire tending, and final bedding adjustments, a choreography aimed at balancing fuel with rest. Historians still argue whether these routines significantly impacted survival rates, but you can feel the logic as warmth seeps from digestion into chilled muscles. Even the method of food preparation matters. Roasting over open flames releases a comforting aroma that permeates the cabin, reinforcing a sense of safety and routine. A quirky tidbit: leftover embers were sometimes used to keep small kettles warm overnight, providing both ambient heat and a ready source of hot food or drink in the pre-dawn hours. You imagine sipping slowly from a tin cup, feeling minor victory in each swallow. Joke number two: nothing says frontier luxury like slightly warm stew at 3 a.m. Animals again play a role. Livestock nearby meant you could secure meat quickly, but it also meant managing waste and proximity, so nighttime routines included careful food placement and attention to animal behavior. Settlers often relied on predictable feeding schedules to minimize disturbances during sleep. Historians still argue whether these routines were born of necessity or habit, but you appreciate the structure. Even small snacks before bed can help. Cornmeal cakes, dried meat strips, or preserved fruits maintain energy without spiking blood sugar. You nibble a piece, realizing the rhythm of eating, fire tending, and layering bedding has become almost ceremonial. A prelude to rest. Quirky tidbit: some pioneers placed small portions of food under blankets for late-night energy boosts, a secret tradition whispered in letters and diaries. Joke number three: apparently, hiding your food under your quilt was both practical and morally acceptable. By the time you settle fully under blankets, fire glowing low, animals huddled nearby, and snow buffering the wind outside, the meal has done its quiet work. Your body is warm, full enough to sustain heat, and ready for sleep. You notice subtle waves of relaxation, the way each layer of preparation, fire, clothing, bedding, proximity, and nourishment, converges into comfort. You close your eyes, letting the cumulative warmth of food, fire, and layered clothing pull you into a gentle, steady slumber. Outside, winter continues, relentless and indifferent, but inside your body feels capable, cozy, and prepared. Tonight you realize sleep is as much about what you carry inside as what surrounds you. Nighttime routines often extend beyond food, clothing, and shelter into small acts of ritual that settlers develop to coax sleep in bitter conditions. You notice that subtle repetitions. Arranging blankets, tending the fire one last time, or checking animals become comforting cues, a gentle prelude to rest. The body begins to associate these gestures with safety and warmth. One mainstream historical fact is that many frontier families maintained evening rituals, even if simple, to prepare for bed. These included tidying bedding, distributing blankets, checking for drafts, and ensuring the fire was at an appropriate level. Historians still argue whether these routines were purely practical or if they also had psychological benefits, but diaries often emphasize the calming effect of these pre-sleep habits. You move through the motions, feeling each adjustment take effect. Quirky tidbit: some pioneers recited small prayers or sang softly to help themselves relax, even if they didn't consider themselves particularly religious. The rhythm of words, like a gentle lullaby, could make the cold seem less formidable. Joke number one: apparently, singing about frostbite is a legitimate frontier pastime. Animals, again, fit into these routines. You check their positions, ensuring that warmth radiates towards sleeping areas and that none are at risk from drafts or collapsed bedding. Settlers quickly learned that even minor disturbances in animal comfort could ripple through human sleep quality. Historians still debate how consciously settlers managed these micro-ecosystems, but the diary evidence is clear it mattered. Lighting is another subtle factor. Firelight is soothing, but too bright, and it interrupts circadian rhythms. Settlers often allowed the hearth to burn down to embers before fully settling, creating a soft glow that illuminated just enough to see without harshness. Quirky tidbits: some families used partially burned logs strategically, knowing that a certain placement created gentle flickers and shadows. You adjust a log carefully, appreciating the artistry and practicality. Joke number 12, apparently. Interior lighting design was a frontier skill, and you've just earned a certificate. You also notice the psychological benefits of preparation. Each completed task, fire managed, bedding arranged, animals positioned, signals progress. The night becomes predictable, if still cold. This predictability allows your nervous system to relax, muscles to release tension, and breathing to slow. Historians still argue whether such small routines measurably improved survival rates, but your body certainly seems to think so. The sensation of layering ritual over physical preparation becomes meditative. You tug blankets just so, tuck stray edges, ensure no gaps invite drafts. Quirky tidbitting: some settlers added a pinch of dried herbs to bedding at this stage, both for scent and for the faint belief it warded off winter ailments. You inhale the faint aroma, feeling oddly reassured. Joke number 3, apparently. Lavender-scented straw ticks are the unsung aromatherapy of the plains. Finally, you settle into position, letting the rhythm of ritual and environment take over. Firelight flickers low, animals breathe softly nearby, snow muffles the wind outside, and your layered clothing and bedding hold steady. The body, mind, and environment converge, forming a microcosm of warmth, security, and predictability. Sleep begins to claim you gradually, a slow descent guided by preparation, repetition, and subtle comfort. Outside, winter is relentless, but inside, your carefully orchestrated ecosystem whispers, "You're safe for now." Tonight, you realize the frontier teaches not only endurance, but also the quiet art of creating conditions conducive to rest, even in extreme cold. Noise, you notice, is a negotiable adversary. The prairie is rarely silent, even at its coldest and darkest. Snow crunches under distant hooves, wind rattles against walls, and the occasional animal shift resonates through the cabin. You lie still, learning to distinguish between harmless sounds and those that might demand action. One mainstream historical fact is that settlers developed a kind of auditory literacy over time, recognizing which noises required attention and which could be ignored. Some even claimed to identify the sound of a coyote versus a wolf, or the difference between an animal moving in straw versus on bare ground. Historians still argue whether such skills were innate or learned through systematic experience, but diaries frequently mention nights spent quietly interpreting sound. You adjust slightly, listening. Quirky tidbits: some pioneers reportedly trained themselves to wake if the fire crackled in an unusual pattern, considering it a subtle early warning system against drafts or accidents. You imagine yourself lying in a bed of straw and hides, ears twitching like a fox in the night. Joke number 1, sleep training now includes fire pattern recognition. Good luck with your modern mattress app. Animals contribute to both warmth and noise. Horses shift in their stalls, dogs shuffle, and occasionally a cow sighs loudly, all adding layers of sound. Settlers quickly learned to integrate these ambient noises into their sleep, understanding which were comforting and which required intervention. Historians still debate whether these adaptations resulted in lighter overall sleep patterns or simply increased alertness, but your half-sleeping mind is perfectly aware of the distinction. Wind is another constant actor. It whines, taps, and moans, filling the cabin with irregular rhythm. You notice that once you attune to its patterns, it becomes less startling and more like a lullaby. Quirky tidbit: Some pioneers used small weights or strips of cloth to quiet flapping boards or canvas, effectively tuning the night to a gentler soundtrack. Joke number 12, nothing like frontier interior acoustics to keep you humble. Even human activity contributes. Family members shift, whisper, or cough, each sound layered into the nighttime orchestra. Settlers adapted to these micro disturbances, sometimes developing informal rules: no moving unless necessary, no unnecessary talking, and quiet coordination for tasks like adding logs to the fire. Historians still argue how much of this was conscious social structure versus unconscious habit, but it clearly shaped sleep quality. You also notice how your perception of noise has shifted. At first, every creak or shuffle felt threatening. Now, you interpret them with nuance, accepting them as part of your environment. This adjustment reflects a broader frontier skills sleeping adaptively, not ideally. Quirky tidbit: some pioneers noted that even small repetitive noises, like a mouse nibbling straw, became strangely soothing over time. Joke number 3, apparently, rodents double as alarm clocks and ASM artists. As you settle, you appreciate the combined effect of warmth, fire bedding, animals, snow, and even noise management. Each element interacts with the others to create a delicate balance, a microclimate engineered for survival and surprisingly conducive to rest. The harsh, indifferent winter exists outside, but inside the orchestrated environment whispers safety, warmth, and slow, deliberate calm. Your eyelids finally close more fully. The night, once intimidating, now serves as a backdrop to sleep, punctuated by the soft hums and sighs of life around you. You drift deeper, carried by the rhythms of fire, wind, and shared warmth, realizing that adaptability, observation, and subtle adjustments have transformed the freezing wilderness into a place capable of sustaining not just life, but restorative sleep. The cold, persistent and indifferent, teaches lessons you hadn't expected. Even in the best prepared cabin with fire, layered bedding, and animals nearby, your body adapts in remarkable ways. You feel subtle shifts in circulation, micro adjustments in posture, and the steady rhythm of shallow, protective breathing. Sleep becomes not just rest, but a negotiation with the elements. One mainstream historical fact is that settlers often experienced fragmented sleep during harsh winters, awaking multiple times to adjust fire, bedding, or clothing. This was less a failure of endurance and more a natural adaptation to extreme conditions. Historians still argue whether this interrupted sleep had long-term physiological effects, but many diaries suggest that settlers managed surprisingly well, relying on brief, repeated cycles of rest. You notice small, almost imperceptible routines emerging. A half-turn shifts body heat to colder limbs. A hand's reach for nearby warmth, a blanket, or even a companion's shoulder. Quirky tidbits: some pioneers slept in positions that would look uncomfortable to modern eyes, twisting and curling to maximize retained heat, sometimes even entwining legs with children or other family members. Joke number 1, apparently, frontier yoga was a necessity, not a trend. Breathing itself becomes a tool. Slow, controlled inhalations prevent icy air from shocking the lungs, while subtle exhalations help trap warmth inside layers. Settlers learned these techniques intuitively, recognizing how even small adjustments in breath could impact comfort. Historians still debate whether such techniques were consciously taught or passed down through observation, but your own rhythm feels effective tonight. Fires, though low, continue their quiet vigilance. Ember management is ongoing even in semi-sleep. You instinctively nudge logs or shift ashes, making tiny corrections that maintain warmth without producing excessive smoke. Quirky tidbit: some families created night fire duties, where one person monitored embers while the rest rested. Joke number 2, you suddenly feel grateful you didn't volunteer for this role tonight. Snow outside acts as a silent partner, insulating walls, muffling sound, and creating a predictable microclimate. You notice subtle temperature changes when snow shifts or melts slightly, and you adjust accordingly. Curling tighter, pulling blankets closer, or repositioning clothing. Historians still argue how much settlers relied on these cues versus instinct, but the tactile feedback is undeniable. animal warmth continues to be invaluable. A horse's flank or a dog's curled body near the foot of your bedding radiates heat that you haven't consciously appreciated until now. Quirky tidbit: some pioneers reported that a warm animal's breath could prevent frost from forming on nearby blankets, a surprising minor miracle of biology. Joke number 3: the frontier unofficially declared animals as certified space heaters. Sleep itself begins to take a different quality. You notice microcyclists' brief wakefulness followed by deeper rest, punctuated by instinctive adjustments. The night is less a single block of unconsciousness and more a series of carefully orchestrated pauses, each ensuring that heat, safety, and comfort remain balanced. Historians still argue whether this constitutes real sleep by modern definitions, but you feel rested in ways that matter. By the early morning hours, your body has settled into this adaptive rhythm. Limbs tucked fire low but steady, animals breathing nearby, snow buffering the cold. You drift fully into the gentle surrender of sleep. The harsh winter outside remains indifferent, but inside, the layered strategies, rituals, and subtle adaptations have created a cocoon where rest is not just possible. It is inevitable. Frostbite lurks quietly in the background, a reminder that even small oversights can have consequences. You notice the subtle tingling in fingers and toes, a gentle nudge from your own body that adjustments are necessary. Frontier settlers learned early that awareness and prompt reaction were essential. Not panic, just careful, measured correction. One mainstream historical fact is that settlers often performed micro-adjustments during sleep, shifting position, tucking blankets, or briefly warming extremities near embers. Historians still argue whether these nightly maneuvers significantly reduced frostbite incidents. But anecdotal evidence from diaries strongly suggests that attentiveness to extremities was life-saving. You flex fingers and toes under blankets, appreciating how even minor movements redistribute warmth. Quirky tidbit: some pioneers slept with hand warmers crafted from heated stones or metal, wrapped carefully to avoid burns. You imagine balancing a warm rock near your feet, a primitive but effective tool. Joke number 1: nothing says luxury like curling up next to a rock for heat. Layering remains crucial. Wool socks, trousers, and hats combine with quilts and hides to create a thermal network that extends to every limb. Settlers understood that even small gaps could spell discomfort, so meticulous attention to tucking, folding, and adjusting was a nightly ritual. Historians still debate whether the elaborate layering was instinctual or taught, but the results speak for themselves. Animals continue to contribute warmth passively, their bodies radiating heat that seeps into the cabin floor and nearby bedding. Quirky tidbit: some settlers observed that dogs or cats would adjust their positions overnight, seemingly seeking optimal heat zones and inadvertently helping human sleepers. Joke number 2: apparently, your pet is a natural thermostat. Long before central heating existed, fire management is ongoing. Even in semi-conscious sleep, you sense the fire's behavior. A subtle crackle or an even glow prompts minor embers adjustments, ensuring warmth is steady without excessive smoke. Settlers often left long burning logs strategically placed to provide hours of consistent heat. Historians still argue whether fire tending during sleep was dangerous or simply an accepted risk, but the practice is well documented. Wind and snow outside continue their nightly dance, testing the integrity of walls and insulation. You notice drafts or subtle shifts in temperature and respond instinctively, repositioning blankets or adjusting bedding. Quirky tidbit: some pioneers inserted spare clothing into gaps to create tiny windbreaks, an improvised but effective tactic. Joke number 3: the ultimate game of where did the cold just sneak in now occupies your semi-conscious mind. By the time true sleep asserts itself, your body has established a careful equilibrium. Frostbite is minimized, heat is trapped efficiently, and the cumulative effect of clothing, bedding, animals, and fire creates a cocoon of relative safety. Outside, winter rages without concern, but inside, you rest in an environment meticulously engineered to sustain human life. This delicate balance of attentiveness, adaptation, and subtle movement exemplifies frontier ingenuity. You drift deeper, aware that sleep here is an active engagement with the environment, not passive surrender. And in this awareness lies both safety and an unexpected comfort, mastery over small details in an otherwise harsh world. The long night stretches on, and your awareness begins to blur between wakefulness and slumber. You notice that rhythm and routine now govern the cabin as much as fire and blankets. Every breath, shift, and adjustment is part of an unspoken choreography developed over countless winter nights. This quiet orchestration becomes almost hypnotic, lulling you closer to deep rest. One mainstream historical fact is that settlers often described winter nights as cyclical periods of active adjustment, followed by longer stretches of restorative sleep. Historians still argue whether this interrupted pattern counts as healthy rest by modern standards. But diaries indicate that the human body adapted remarkably well to this segmented sleep schedule. You shift slightly, testing the warmth around your torso, feet, and head. Quirky tidbitting, some settlers used small pillows of dried herbs or had to cushion joints and maintain heat, believing they could help with circulation and prevent stiffness. You adjust one such makeshift pillow under your knees, appreciating the subtle comfort. Joke number 1, Frontier Ergonomics, now featuring hay-filled lumbar support. Animals remain steady allies, their breathing a gentle, reassuring presence. You notice how their warmth, movement, and even the occasional snuffle become integral cues in the rhythm of night. Settlers observed these patterns, sometimes using animal behavior as an early warning for storms or intruders. Historians still debate how consciously these observations influenced survival, but you sense their utility. Fire embers glow faintly, casting soft shadows that dance across walls and ceiling. The low light is comforting, not intrusive, aiding in a gradual transition into sleep. Quirky tidbit, some pioneers carefully arranged embers to provide consistent ambient warmth for several hours, like an analog thermostat. Joke number 2, apparently, glowing coals were the original nightlight. Wind and snow outside maintain their relentless presence, but your layered insulation and careful bedding adjustments create a buffer. You notice the subtle differences in air movement, responding unconsciously by shifting blankets or repositioning clothing. Historians still argue whether settlers developed conscious strategies for microclimate management or simply learned through repetition, but either way, it's effective. Food consumed earlier continues to influence your warmth. Digestion releases steady heat, particularly from protein and fat-rich meals. Settlers understood that proper intake before bed was crucial for sustaining warmth through long, cold hours. Quirky tidbit, leftover embers were sometimes used to gently reheat small morsels during the night, a minor but appreciated convenience. Joke number 3, midnight snacks, Frontier Edition. You notice subtle cycles in your own breathing and body heat. The initial chill of the night has passed, replaced by a managed warmth. Muscles relax, circulation normalizes, and a gentle heaviness settles over your limbs. Every adjustment, ritual, and layer now functions in harmony, creating a microclimate that is simultaneously protective and sleep-inducing. As you drift further into this carefully constructed cocoon, you reflect on the intricate interplay of fire, wind, snow, clothing, bedding, animals, and food. Each element alone is helpful, but together they form a network of subtle defenses that transform a hostile environment into a surprisingly habitable one. Outside, the prairie continues its relentless winter symphony, but inside, you rest in controlled comfort, fully immersed in the quiet art of survival. By now, the night has deepened into its quietest phase. Your awareness of cold, wind, and snow has softened into background noise. Instead, you notice the gentle pulse of life within the cabin. The measured breathing of companions, the soft rumble of animals, the residual warmth of embers. These subtle rhythms lull you further into a calm, almost meditative state. One mainstream historical fact is that settlers often describe the deep hours of winter as a time of restorative sleep. The air trembles with fewer interruptions, routines, and microclimates were established. Historians still argue how much of this was physiological adaptation versus psychological acclimatization, But the consensus is clear: humans can thrive under repeated, a conditioned exposure to cold if proper measures are taken. You adjust slightly, finding a more comfortable angle, mindful of extremities. Quirky tidbit: a pioneer sometimes created small, strategic pillows from bundles of clothing or moss to prevent numbness in elbows or knees. These small, improvised comforts were surprisingly effective. Joke number one: apparently, frontier pillow engineering is both an art and a necessity. Fire continues its quiet vigil, with embers glowing faintly, casting soft shadows across walls and ceiling. The subtle illumination provides reassurance, letting you detect movements or shifts without disturbing the calm. Historians still debate whether such low-level firelight affected circadian rhythms, but settlers clearly relied on it for comfort and safety. Animals, lying nearby or in attached stalls, emit warmth and occasional noises that become part of the night soundtrack. You notice how their breathing synchronizes with yours, a subtle exchange of rhythm and heat. Quickie tidbit: some diaries describe moments where the warmth from a dog curled at a child's feet prevented frostbite and contributed to uninterrupted sleep. Joke number two: pets as tiny, four-legged radiators, the ultimate survival hack. Snow outside muffles distant sounds and stabilizes temperature fluctuations. Settlers quickly learned that heavy snowfall, while challenging during the day, actually improved sleeping conditions at night by acting as insulation. Historians still argue whether this benefit was universally understood, but it is consistently noted in personal accounts. You feel a subtle sense of relief as the white blanket outside cushions the cabin. Wind, meanwhile, continues to test the integrity of your preparations. Small drafts occasionally sneak in, prompting half-conscious adjustments, tucking a sleeve, shifting a blanket, or repositioning a log near the hearth. These minor interventions are both habitual and instinctive, honed through repeated nights of adaptation. Joke number three, apparently. Frontier sleep involves more tactical adjustments than a game of chess. As the night deepens, your body begins to experience a gentle, restorative cycle. Extremities remain warm, core temperature stabilizes, and breathing slows. Sleep is no longer interrupted by discomfort or worry. The combination of clothing, bedding, animals, fire, and snow has created a controlled environment, allowing rest to flow uninterrupted. You drift further, feeling the cumulative effect of all prior adjustments and routines. The environment around you, once hostile, now functions as a partner in survival. Each layer, each precaution, and each small ritual comes together to produce a night of endurance, comfort, and surprisingly peaceful rest. Outside, winter rages, indifferent and relentless, but inside, your careful preparation has transformed it into a haven of warmth and quiet. The approach of dawn is subtle but noticeable. Temperature shifts, the faint change in wind patterns, and the first hints of light filtering through snow-laden windows signal that the long night is nearing its end. You remain cocooned in layers, yet your body starts to prepare for the day ahead, shifting slightly in anticipation. Even in sleep, the frontier demands vigilance. One mainstream historical fact is that settlers often woke briefly before sunrise to tend fires, check animals, or prepare for the early morning chores. Historians still argue whether this interrupted sleep pattern had negative effects or was a necessary adaptation, but diaries suggest it became a predictable, almost soothing rhythm. You notice how instinctively you begin minor adjustments to blankets and clothing. Quirky tidbit: some pioneers kept small amounts of embers in pans near sleeping areas, allowing them to gently reheat water or food without fully waking. You imagine reaching toward a faint warmth to sip a barely thought-of cup of tea. Joke number one: frontier nightlife includes low-key, semi-conscious meal prep, because who really likes frostbite before coffee? Animals are already stirring. Horses shift, dogs stretch, and even the occasional cat navigates its way across blankets. Settlers used these gentle signals as cues to begin slow preparation for the day. Historians still argue whether these micro-awakenings were truly restful or simply a necessary adaptation to survival, but they clearly structured the morning routines. You sense the rhythm, letting it guide your movements. Fire embers glow faintly, flickering against logs and walls. Even at this early hour, you instinctively adjust embers to maintain a minimal but consistent heat output. Quirky tidbitting. Some settlers use this time to dry wet clothing or warm small items for immediate use, a practical multitasking that maximized efficiency. Joke number 12, apparently. Early morning fire tending doubles as light exercise and ASMR. Snow and insulation have done their work overnight. Walls remain relatively warm, and drafts are minimized. You notice subtle temperature gradients in the room, responding with minor body adjustments. Settlers often performed these assessments without fully waking. A practice honed from repeated winter nights. Historians still debate the cognitive adaptations behind this skill, but it clearly contributed to survival. Food consumed the previous evening continues to provide warmth from digestion, extending the comfort of night into early morning. Small shifts in body position optimize circulation and retain heat, ensuring you're not grated by frost or stiffness. Quirky tidbit. Some pioneers even stored small pieces of breakfast-ready food under bedding for a quick, semi-conscious snack before fully rising. Joke number 3. Early risers in the frontier knew the value of covert cuisine. As light slowly brightens the cabin, you feel a gradual transition from deep sleep to semi-alert awareness. The environment, once carefully curated for uninterrupted rest, now shifts its role toward the practicality of morning survival. You adjust, stretch, and breathe, appreciating the subtle interplay of warmth, insulation, and routine that carried you through the longest, coldest hours. Outside, winter remains indifferent, but inside, the accumulated strategies of night, layers, fire, animals, insulation, and small rituals, prepare you for the day ahead. You are rested enough to face it. Though the comfort of sleep lingers, a gentle reminder of the fragile art of winter survival on the frontier. Morning light filters weakly through frost-lined windows, signaling the slow end of night. You stretch beneath layers of blankets, taking in the faint warmth still radiating from embers, animals, and accumulated body heat. The night has been long, disciplined, and surprisingly comfortable, and now you begin to notice how each element of preparation carried its influence forward into the early hours. One mainstream historical fact is that settlers often used this first light to inspect firewood, bedding, and animal positions, ensuring that everything remained functional and ready for the day. Historians still argue whether these routines were purely practical or also reinforced psychological comfort, but accounts emphasize the sense of control and preparedness they provided. You shift slightly, adjusting blankets and tucking extremities that have gone cold overnight. Quirky tidbit pioneers sometimes kept small warming stones or heated tins near the head of the bed, subtly radiating heat to hands or feet before rising. You reach for one, enjoying the gentle radiance. Joke number 1, apparently, your personal frontier heater doubles as an unacknowledged bedside companion. Animals are fully awake, their soft movements and sounds forming a quiet morning symphony. Horses shift in stalls, dogs yawn and stretch, and the occasional cat navigates through the bedding. Settlers interpreted these cues instinctively, using animal behavior to plan early chores or anticipate weather changes. Historians still debate whether this awareness was a conscious survival strategy or simply learned habit, but it clearly shaped daily life. Food and drink begin to play a new role. Early settlers often had small pre-breakfast snacks or hot water heated over embers to ward off the lingering chill. Quirky tidbit, some families prepared minimal, high-calorie foods before dawn, like dried meat or nuts, to stabilize warmth until the main meal. Joke number 2, apparently. The frontier breakfast menu was all about survival efficiency. You notice how layered insulation continues to function even as the day begins. Wool, straw, and hides retain residual warmth, making the transition from sleep to wakefulness more gradual. Settlers developed an intuitive understanding of layering for prolonged thermal comfort. Historians still argue whether these practices were consciously refined or simply emergent from necessity, but the evidence of diary entries suggests remarkable consistency. Wind and snow, though relentless, have been largely neutralized overnight. Walls, snowbanks, and strategic placement of bedding and fire embers minimize drafts. Quirky tidbits, some pioneers even built small snow tunnels or windbreaks leading to animal stalls, creating protected pathways for pre-dawn chores. Joke number 3 apparently, snow was both a threat and an ally, depending on how creatively you used it. By now, your body is fully attuned to the rhythms of winter survival. Extremities are warmed, digestion continues to fuel internal heat, and the environment feels like an extension of your own body. The night's lessons in layering, animal warmth, fire management, and subtle movement have left a residue of comfort that carries you into wakefulness. The long night has ended, but the memory of carefully orchestrated survival lingers. You rise slowly, savoring the residual warmth and the quiet efficiency of a system built over countless nights. Outside, winter reigns indifferent, but inside, the culmination of preparation and adaptation has created a space of calm, warmth, and reassurance. You step gently into the morning, carrying the quiet mastery of night with you. As the morning unfolds, you notice how every detail of the night's preparation continues to influence your comfort. The fire has reduced to gentle embers, but their warmth still radiates slowly through the cabin. Your layered clothing, bedding, and nearby animals maintain a microclimate that eases the transition from sleep to wakefulness. You realize that survival isn't a single act. It's an accumulation of small, deliberate choices. One mainstream historical fact is that settlers often structured mornings around incremental checks of heat, clothing, bedding, and animals before fully emerging into the harsh daylight. Historians still argue how consciously these routines were refined versus learned through experience, but their consistency across diaries suggests a deliberate system of micro-survival. You stretch slightly, appreciating the rhythm of practice built over repeated nights. Quirky tidbits, some pioneers kept small heat-retaining objects, like warm bricks or stones, at their feet to maintain residual warmth while performing initial morning chores. You carefully place one under a blanket, feeling the comforting radiance. Joke number 1 apparently, the frontier's unofficial motto was, "Never underestimate the power of a hot rock." Animal behavior now becomes a full guide to daily planning. Horses paw lightly, dogs yawn and circle, and cats adjust positions around the cabin. Settlers used these subtle cues to anticipate needs, such as feeding schedules, water replenishment, or even detecting weather shifts. Historians still debate how much of this was learned instinct versus conscious observation, but the practice clearly improved efficiency. Food preparation is the next layer in the morning ritual. Settlers often ate small, high-energy breakfasts that built on the previous night's stored heat. Quirky tidbitting. Hot grains or dried meats were sometimes rewarmed over embers, extending the comfort generated by last night's fire. Joke number 2, apparently, the frontier breakfast was less about taste and more about thermal survival. You notice the interplay of residual warmth and sunlight. Even a weak winter sun contributes to your comfort, complementing the fire and animal heat. Settlers quickly learned to maximize these natural advantages, positioning sleeping areas and morning routines to capture early light. Historians still argue whether these placements were intentional or coincidental, but the benefit is undeniable. Wind and snow outside continue their immutable patterns, but inside, the orchestrated environment of blankets, animals, fire, and insulation maintains stability. Quirky tidbit, some pioneers added small snow mounds along the cabin's windward side each morning to reinforce insulation disrupted overnight. Joke number 3 apparently, frontier landscaping doubles as climate control. By now, you feel a deep appreciation for the continuity of survival strategies. The night's careful layering, fire tending, animal positioning, and moisture management are not isolated actions. They form an integrated system that carries into the morning. Your body is warmed, alert, and ready, and yet the memory of restful night lingers, a testament to the cumulative effect of small adaptations. As you rise fully, you carry forward not just heat and alertness, but a subtle understanding survival in the wild, particularly in freezing winters, is less about heroics and more about observation, adjustment, and gentle consistency. Outside, winter rages. Inside, the legacy of the night's orchestration allows you to meet the day with quiet mastery and lingering comfort. The final stretch of night blends seamlessly into morning, leaving you with a profound sense of continuity and resilience. You notice the residual warmth of the fire, the comforting weight of layers, and the subtle presence of animals nearby, the cumulative effect of the past hours. Careful bedding, strategic positioning, and micro adjustments has created a cocoon that carried you through the harshest hours of winter. You realize that survival is not a single skill but an intricate interplay of observation, preparation, and gentle adaptation. One mainstream historical fact is that settlers often reflected on winter nights in diaries, noting how meticulous routines, animal warmth, and small environmental adjustments directly contributed to comfort and survival. Historians still argue how much of this was conscious innovation versus repeated trial and error, but the consistency of these accounts shows that careful management of resources was critical. You slowly stretch, feeling each layer of clothing and bedding still working to maintain warmth. Quirky tidbit: some pioneers kept small bundles of aromatic herbs tucked into bedding, believing they encouraged warmth, deterred pests, or simply added a faint comfort to otherwise cold nights. You inhale the subtle scent, noting how even minor details can influence perception of comfort. Joke number one: apparently, frontier aromatherapy included a healthy dose of pine needles and sage. Animals continue their gentle rhythm, contributing heat and companionship. Horses shift, dogs stretch, and smaller critters stir quietly, reminding you that life moves alongside you even in the stillest hours. Settlers integrated animal behavior into survival strategies, using their presence for both warmth and subtle cues about environmental conditions. Historians still debate the cognitive awareness required to anticipate such interactions, but diaries make it clear that attentive observation mattered. Embers and firelight maintain their understated vigil, casting gentle illumination across walls and ceilings. You adjust small logs, ensuring heat is maintained without producing smoke that could disturb breathing. Quirky tidbit: settlers sometimes reserved small glowing embers for morning ignition, ensuring continuity of warmth as night transitioned to day. Joke number trog: apparently, embers were the frontier's unsung alarm clock. Snow outside remains an indifferent observer, insulating walls and muffling distant sounds. You notice how its presence continues to stabilize interior temperature, protecting against wind and sudden chill. Settlers leveraged this quietly, unknowing that the environment itself could become an ally with proper management. Historians still argue whether snow's insulating properties were fully understood scientifically, but empirically, its benefits were undeniable. As your body begins to anticipate full wakefulness, you reflect on the patterns of the night: wine negotiation, moisture management, fire tending, animal warmth, layering, and subtle rituals. Each element alone is useful, but together they create a system that transforms the harshest winter night into a manageable, even restful experience. A quirky tidbit: some pioneers considered mastery of these small routines a mark of competence, humorously ranking neighbors based on sleep efficiency in winter. Joke number three: apparently, frontier sleep could be competitive in an entirely understated way. Now, as dawn spreads slowly across the landscape, your final moments of semi-conscious rest are filled with gentle awareness. Outside, the prairie remains relentless and indifferent, but inside, you have learned that survival is a delicate art of balance. Each adjustment, ritual, and layer of preparation is a testament to human adaptability and ingenuity. Your breath slows, muscles relax, and mind drifts toward the lingering comfort of the night's orchestrated microclimate. The night is behind you, but the lessons and subtle mastery remain. You carry forward warmth, confidence, and the quiet reassurance that even in the harshest conditions, a careful observation and gentle adaptation allow life and sleep to persist. The first light of morning is soft, almost tentative, as if the prairie itself is exhaling after the long night. Your limbs stretch slowly, the blankets and layers holding warmth gently against your skin. Outside, frost clings to branches and snow rests quietly, muffling distant sound. While inside, the cabin remains a heaven shaped by preparation and quiet observation. You feel the residual heat of embers, the subtle radiance from animals, and the comforting weight of layers, all merging into a slow, steady warmth that moves through your body. Every breath is deliberate, each exhalation releasing the tension of the night. You notice small details, the faint creak of a log, the gentle sigh of a horse, the whisper of wind against snow. These sounds, once sources of vigilance, now form a soothing background, a natural lullaby that eases the mind. The night's adjustments, bedding, fire, clothing, and animals have woven together into a cocoon, allowing the body to relax fully and drift gradually toward wakefulness. You carry with you the subtle lessons of endurance, patience, attentiveness, and the gentle art of working with the environment rather than against it. The chill outside remains indifferent, but inside warmth persists and comfort is tangible. Each layer, each careful placement of bedding or log, each minor ritual contributes to a sense of security that allows your mind to rest. As you linger in this state between sleep and waking, notice how slow, deliberate awareness can be restorative. The night, though harsh, has been navigated with care, and your body responds in kind. Warmth flows, breathing slows, and the sense of quiet mastery settles gently over you. Allow your muscles to relax fully, your thoughts to soften, and your consciousness to drift slowly, carried by the steady rhythm of survival, comfort, and rest. Now, when you rise, you carry not just warmth, but a calm confidence, a quiet resilience forged in the slow, deliberate hours of winter, ready to meet the day gently and mindfully.